Hello again, thank you. So, in the last half hour, Peter and our fine panelists before defined the problem, and now we have the solution. And I would encourage you to go to the Aspen Strategy Group website to look at a fantastic report we just put out on integrated deterrence. We think of it as a solution to how we think about China. It's called Integrated Deterrence, a sum greater than its parts. And luckily, everybody on the stage has participated in this report that we've done over there at MITRE. I'm very pleased that the authors of the report are all here, and maybe we'll just have end. Chris Bassler is here. Marin, can you guys stand up? The report authors. My colleague Brent Katz, who's our Statecraft Fellow, and Will Kramer, they're all here. Kirkman are here. They wrote the report. Please check it out. It's absolutely fascinating. And we're going to discuss it now. All these people are so accomplished. I think I'll just give their current title, otherwise I'd be up here all day. We've got Dr. Keoki Jackson, who is the Senior Vice President and General Manager of MITRE's National Security Sector. We have Dr. Mara Karlin, who is performing the duties of Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and is also the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities at the U.S. Department of Defense. And we have Elizabeth Rosenberg, who is the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the Department of the Treasury. Thank you very much. Back over to Peter Spiegel.
Interpretive dance instead.
Check. So we're going to solve all the problems of Chinese policy, but we can't get the microphones to work. Thank you very much. Just to regain my train of thought, Keoki, I want to start with you, mostly because you have a PhD in astrophysics from MIT. So all these people on this stage are far smarter than I am. The paper is very interesting reading, and I guess I don't want to necessarily insert yet more acronyms into debate. So integrated defense, in my interpretation, is just basically making sure all elements of the federal government are joined up when we deal with China. It is not just the Pentagon and the State Department, the traditional places where foreign and defense policies happen. It's Treasury, it's commerce, it's in the communication space and the information space. Take me through a bit about whether I got that right, first of all. But second of all, since you're the sort of the non-administration person on the panel here, how do you think that the administration is doing thus far in joining all the parts together?
I think you're kind of putting me on the spot here.
That's my intention.
And first of all, I did want to second the thanks, certainly to the MITRE team, but to Liz, Tamara, for participating along with many others and putting together the material that went into this report. So really excited about that. Maybe I'll start, with just a step back, and then I'll try to get at what you're saying. Why should we care? Like, what's different today that necessitates a new approach? And I think, I grew up on the North Shore of Oahu, just a few minutes from where, I guess, 82 years ago, right this minute, so 8 o'clock in Hawaii right now, we saw what can happen when deterrence fails, right? And so MITRE, we talk about solving problems for a safer world. For us, there's no bigger challenge and more important challenge than integrated deterrence and making sure that we prevent and deter great power competition and conflict, great power conflict. So now, you said, okay, well, are we just using all the national government powers or levers that we can pull? I'd say yes, and I think the key thing, and you see this with my colleagues up here on stage, this is much more than just those governmental levers. And so if you think about integration and that integration and deterrence, yes, it is absolutely working across DOD, the IC, Treasury, State, Commerce, all the other levers of governmental power. But this is geographic integration. Think about our allies and partners around the world. This is integration with one of our greatest strengths, our private sector, our financial sector, and making sure that we're taking care and taking advantage of those strengths as well. So when you talk about integration and integrated deterrence, you need to think quite broadly. And then how are we doing? Look, I have the opportunity to work alongside colleagues in the government every day. This is an extraordinarily difficult challenge. But I will say this, if you look at the Chinese Communist Party and that sort of top-down approach that they take, and that can be remarkably effective, I think, in some short-term and maybe narrow kinds of situations. But we were just talking here at the table before we came in here, the flexibility, the adaptability, the agility, the independence that our system in the United States enables, that I think is a great power, and that's one of the things that you're seeing here from my colleagues every day.
Let me talk a bit about putting the current government aside, but just talk about the difficulty in getting all these agencies to work together. Because it's not just the big bureaucracies and stuff like that. Each department does represent different interests. And I'm reminded of the famous Margaret Thatcher line, which I now know what the different departments do. The Department of Agriculture represents the interests of agriculture. The Department of Trade and Industry represents the interests of trade industry. And the Foreign Office represents foreigners. And it is very difficult to get, not just for bureaucratic reasons, but each cabinet department will have different interests that they feel are primus inter pares. The Treasury Department may, for instance, be much more interested in economic growth, whereas the Defense Department must be much more concerned about threats that are right in front of our eyes. Is that the biggest hurdle of getting intergovernmental cooperation, or are there other hurdles that you think, again, we don't have to sort of to say anything about the current administration, but as you look at the problem of getting the entire federal government focused on a threat, what do you think are the biggest hurdles to getting that to happen?
Well, again, not speaking for the government, I would say, first of all of those agencies are operating with the interests of the United States, first and foremost, right? And yes, they all have their individual roles to play. So what are some of the biggest hurdles? I mean, what we're finding is that, there are a lot of mixed authorities. And so having clarity about who's allowed to do what, when, to whom is something that is particularly challenging. Another aspect is just information sharing. And there are challenges in sharing, and for very good reasons, challenges for sharing information because we want to protect the privacy, we want to protect the law enforcement sort of privileges. So all of those things are critically important, but we need to share information better, both within the United States and then, and this came up in the previous panel, we need to share much better with our allies and partners because they're a critical piece of that. So those are two things I'd highlight.
Okay. Madam Secretary, or Mara, if I could, let me ask you to sort of do a bit of a real-world example on this one, because as Neve said, you have a very, very long and distinguished CV. I picked one thing out, which is, in your current job, you did work on modernization of the force posture in the Indo-Pacific. Okay, so that's pointing out of the spear, classic DoD kind of thing. Was there an ability or an effort to try to bring in other departments when you're thinking about Indo-Pacific posture? And how did that, if so, how did that work?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I do just want to thank folks for being here today, and thanks folks for pulling together such a thoughtful report. I think it really is a nice contribution to the literature on integrated deterrence. So when we are looking at the Indo-Pacific, we've really tried to take this approach that makes sure that the U.S. military is more combat credible, more forward, and more together. And obviously that is our slice of the pie, but it only works when you've got the entire US government really rowing together, right? Because we care about the Indo-Pacific, not just for security reasons, obviously, for diplomatic reasons, for economic reasons, et cetera, and also so do our allies and our partners. I will say, since you asked about posture specifically, the last year or so has actually been probably among the most transformative in our Indo-Pacific posture in many, many years. You see this with the spectacular progress that we've had with countries like Australia, with Japan, with Singapore, with Papua New Guinea, which I think is in fact just an interesting case study given the heart of your question, where we've just signed pretty recently an important defense cooperation agreement and have had a real whole of government effort, across Washington to engage on that front. So absolutely, we've got to take that approach holistically. And indeed, when we step back and look at integrated deterrence, right, it works when we are integrating among the key cohorts inside our Department of Defense, across our US government, and with our allies and partners. And when we're integrating in a meaningful way to think about the different types of deterrence, I am struck, of course, by your comment reminding us what today is, right? And when we study the history of the December 7th, 1941 attacks, there's a tremendous piece of literature that came out of it by Roberta Wohlstetter, where she talks about signals and noise. And effectively, her argument is you have to understand everything you're doing and that your adversary or challenger is doing so you can pick up when things are changing, right? So you can pick up the signals amidst the noise. And I think that's such a nice animating construct when we are thinking about integrated deterrence.
Let me ask you, though, because I remember from my time covering the Pentagon, I mean, in many ways, in the interagency process, the Pentagon is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, or whatever the analogy is. And I remember Secretary Gates saying, you know, the State Department has as many diplomats as I have in one carrier group, right? And it's just, the scale is so much bigger with at the Pentagon. Talk to me a bit about that capacity. If you're trying to do integrated defense and you need partnerships with various other agencies in these other areas, what I remember from covering the Pentagon is it always comes back, oh, the Pentagon's got the people, let's get them to do it. How do you sort of break that habit to make sure there is the capacity, there is the personnel, all these other things that if this whole of government effort is going to happen, needs to occur?
Absolutely. So look, we have seen periods of time across the post 9/11 wars where it was pretty easy to turn to the Department of Defense, right? We're excited. We have a bunch of capability. You have us a hard problem. We're going to want to run at it. But look, there are opportunity costs to that, and we're not necessarily going to be the best solution to a lot of these challenges. And so when we've thought about integrated deterrence and we've thought about implementing our national defense strategy, a lot of it has been making sure that we are using the U.S. military for where it is fit for purpose, right? Where's our competitive or comparative advantage? Why are you turning to us and not turning to Liz over at Treasury? And so to realize this, it's important that we make sure our own house is as together as possible. And I think you've seen some good examples of that, whether we're talking about the Indo-Pacific, the response to Russia's terrible attack on Ukraine, whether you look at the Middle East. And a lot of that is bringing together folks who are looking across the domains, across the theaters, right, so different regions, and across the spectrum of conflict. So we can really understand what are all of the ways that we understand this challenge set, and what are all the tools we have in our toolkit for trying to respond. That allows us to input much more thoughtfully and frankly effectively into an interagency conversation.
Liz, or Madam Secretary, or Liz, if you don't mind, let me ask you, sort of as the department that people don't think of immediately when they think of national security, talk a bit about that. Now, frankly, your office has been sort of at the front end of this since September 11th, and obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine suddenly, in many ways, was co-equal when it comes to projecting national security, because the financial war with Russia was almost as consequential as it was the kinetic war. But tell me a little bit about how the Treasury Department, which is sort of constitutionally mandated to deal with a domestic economic, and of course there's the international department where, you know, Lael Brainerd came from originally, and other rather prominent people in your administration. How does the Treasury Department transform itself into a tool of foreign policy, and is that a natural place for the Treasury Department to be, given your domestic mandate?
Thank you for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and to speak with all of you. It doesn't often feel to me like Treasury is a backwater for national security policy when I have the opportunity to speak to Congress and hear the multitude of calls for sanctions immediately when there's ever a national security problem of any form or fashion that people are concerned about and want to run at. So I feel as though I'm in good company with lots of dance partners, for what it's worth. But the thing about being the largest economy in the world is that having a domestic mandate, economic or financial mandate, with which actually I don't entirely agree that that's the priority mandate for this agency, but nevertheless, as the largest economy in the world, that has a number of tremendous comparative advantages when it comes to the value of our capital markets, their liquidity and utility for investors and financial participants all over the world, the utility of our financial institutions, the value of our currency. What that then means is that this domestic policymaking is of tremendous international significance. And because of the leverage that comes with having this valuable reserve currency and highly functional capital markets and institutions, it confers to the United States, of course, an enormous amount of leverage. And power, authority to, through the making of financial policy, advance an array of aims, including national security ones. So I sometimes characterize some of our national security tools stewarded by the Department of the Treasury as what people think of as appropriate for when diplomacy is not working and military options feel too difficult to countenance. It's true that they can coexist with diplomacy, of course, and military action, but there's a huge domain in that middle ground, and that gives us lots of work to do.
Let me push you a bit. I mean, you're of course right. That's not the constitutional mandate. I was being slightly exaggerating to make a point, but there is, even within Treasury, I would imagine, tensions on this front. I'm based in New York, so I end up spending a lot of time talking to Wall Street, and there are voices repeatedly in the financial sector and in Silicon Valley who think this town has gone nuts on China, and they would like to go back to doing business with China. And it's not small, obscure people. It's Ray Dalio, it's Hank Paulson. There are some people out there on the Wall Street end of things that I assume are talking to Secretary Yellen and others in Treasury, saying the business of America is business, and you are in many ways hindering our ability to do that. Where your mandate within Treasury is very different. I just wonder if there is any way you can talk a bit about the tensions perhaps within the department that is economic growth on the one hand, but also now dealing with national security on the other hand, and whether those two things go together necessarily.
There's definitely that tension. To be very crude, sometimes I think of it as those of my colleagues that are in charge of building wealth and those of my colleagues, which includes me, which are in charge of destroying wealth. But I don't think tension is bad. I think tension makes for very good policy, and for any of you who have been part of a red teaming exercise, you might also subscribe to the notion that it's good to think about multiple competing priorities and how to rank and organize them and what that means about trade-offs. So national security policy is always about trade-offs. And as we're thinking about, you chose China as an example, let's think about Russia. So there are, of course, lots of businesses, international businesses, US businesses, that did a lot of business and made a lot of money in Russia and had choices to make, even aside from what sanctions from the United States and over 30 other countries did to clarify for them how they should make those choices in order to be legal by our rules. But nevertheless, even beyond that, what they wanted to do, who they wanted to do business with, what kind of business partners they wanted to have, and that caused for them, continues to cause for anyone who wants to operate financially, economically in Russia, that the necessity to prioritize those choices, make those decisions, engage in trade-offs.
That's true. I guess I would argue that other than perhaps the energy sector, the businesses' opportunities in China are so much more enormous, and the current investment in China is much more enormous than it is in Russia. But let me just follow up on that and ask you to go back. Because one of the things, Keoki, you said in your opening remarks, I guess I focused internally on our government, but you mentioned alliances, which I think is an interesting element on this. And again, playing slightly, when I first arrived in Washington, whatever it was, 30 years ago, it was an embassy in a capital with maybe military attaché, and maybe there was someone from Treasury in there and whatnot. But you tend to think that the main engagement, okay, USTR also, they do trade stuff, the main engagement with allies in Asia or even elsewhere tend to be the job of diplomats. When you say that alliances are part of this intergovernmental or IG approach, how do you see that functioning? Is that just a matter of there's a seat at the table for the top tier treaty allies, or is it again that the cabinet departments that are here have to have their own relationships with the various cabinet departments in our allies, so it's a more integrated approach to dealing with China in particular?
Yeah, maybe I'll come back to something that Tony Cotton, General Cotton, said earlier today, and he talked about his job as being strategic deterrence, not just nuclear deterrence. And if you think about integrated deterrence, what we see coming out of China in particular today, this is integrated in a sense on their side, where this is not just military might, but increasingly the economic coercion that they're able to muster against not just the United States, but around the world. The diplomatic and wolf warrior kinds of attacks that we see. So now I would argue that it's a yes and, right? So it is those military-to-military partnerships. It is the intelligence sharing that we've seen. It is absolutely, and I want to really highlight this, if you think about diplomatic, information, military, economic, I say, despite the propensity to look at sanctions as a real opportunity to shape behavior and shape, what our others do and think, we have probably underutilized the economic levers, the economic deterrence here in the United States, and we need to come back to that. So I'll highlight 3 points, and these all tie internationally, not just domestically, but the economic statecraft. We need an answer that is better than what we have today to Belt and Road, and we are taking some very important steps with this administration. So that's one area. But think about economic security. Now, this is, yes, the United States. We need to make sure that our industrial base, including our defense industrial base, our supply chains, including our global supply chains, our economic systems and our economic strength, or our financial strength, all of these things need to be protected, including our ability to continue to innovate and become that next, the company or the country that delivers what's coming next. And then the last, and this is what I call economic warfare. And it's interesting. There's a National Security Council memo declassified from 1948, but basically says, this is taking very specific action and measures to weaken adversaries' economies so that they are unable to practice war and practice aggression. And let us not for a minute think that economic warfare is not being practiced on us today. And so we need to have that in mind as we think about the things that we're working with our allies and partners.
Liz, if you wouldn't mind maybe just going back to you on this one, because obviously it's a slightly unfair question for you because it involves the Commerce Department in some ways as well as Treasury. But respond to that in that, obviously you're the sanctions person, and as you said, everyone calls for sanctions, but actually when you're dealing with China particularly in the developing world, it is actually in many ways an economic warfare, maybe too strong a word, but economic competition. And you are the economic agency, I guess. Talk a little bit about that. And again, this is slightly unfairly aimed at you because again, it's more Commerce Department. But it is Jake Sullivan who has coined this approach to China, which is high wall, small yard. Is that right? Yeah. So that we cooperate in certain areas, but there's certain areas where we're going to be particularly national security focused when it comes to the economic relationship. Again, it's a little bit more Commerce than Treasury, but I'm just curious if you could respond a bit to Keoki's argument there.
I appreciate what you were saying, and I think there have been a lot of good, interesting recent efforts to define this nomenclature, including as a way to to create this nomenclature, to give a framework for understanding different kinds of economic activity that has particular relevance for our policy and national security. And so I don't seek to affirm or dispute the categorization you made, but I offer that it isn't just commerce. You broaden it there, but what we're getting at here is the broad use of various economic tools and instrumentalities that will advance our aims, which happen to be strategic or security oriented. So yes, we're talking about a kind of embrace, a new embrace for the United States of industrial policy, right? So this has to do with manufacturing in certain areas to protect, to create, cultivate, or protect an advantage in manufacturing areas that happen to have a strategic or security significance for us. But it could also be an alternative to Belt and Road, the function of lending in the United States, or as supported and endorsed by our economic policy leaders, even if done by other countries or multilateral bodies. So it's debt and lending, it's manufacturing, it's definitely the conduct of financial policy, which can be more the domain of the Treasury Department. So I agree with that it is all of those, and it's appropriate to think carefully about how each of those can be in service of national security aims. By the way, small yard, high fence has an origin. I'll give a shout out to Kevin Wolf. Prior, an earlier iteration of Commerce Department from a couple of administrations ago, and an early ZTE action, if any of you can think back to that, which in a way was a particular harbinger of the world we now find ourselves in with respect to manufacturing and the role of commercial entities in the competition, economic competition the U.S. has with China.
Yes, we forget about those. It wasn't that long ago. Let me go back to you, Mara, and talk a bit more DOD, because I'm asking a question where I'm slightly exaggerating the point to make a point, but I'll ask you to address it anyway. You know, the point of the American military is to fight wars. And that's why we train our soldiers, that's why we train our airmen, that's why we train our sailors. And what we're talking about in the paper, in integrated defense, is something other than that. And I just wonder if you could talk to the point about mission creep, mission confusion, chain of commands, these kinds of things the Pentagon that gets very, very concerned about. Is there any concern in your mind that as we talk about the DoD working with other agencies on things other than warfare, that the mission gets slightly confused and that the Pentagon is not actually doing what we've hired soldiers, sailors, and airmen to do?
Thank you. I'm not sure I would say the point of the U.S. military is to fight wars. I think the point of the U.S. military is to be able to deter wars whenever and wherever we can, and if that fails, to be ready to prevail in those wars. That should be the sine qua non of a military. And of course, we happen to have the very best military right now that I think we've seen in the history of the world, which is a pretty nice situation. It is important for that military to be able to prioritize the way that the force is being used and the way that the future force is being designed and developed. That's why we have a national defense strategy. And the one that came out in 2022, I might say, is pretty darn good. And it's pretty good because it has serious focus. It makes clear the top priority. You
did write some of it, didn't
I
you?
might have played a little role in it. So there's some bias in here, but I happen to think it's exactly right. Right? It's focused on the urgent need to sustain and strengthen deterrence vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. And that's because we see no other country with the will and increasingly the capability to try to fundamentally reshape the global security order, which would have tremendous impact on all of us and the entire world, obviously. So it's got that focused. It recognizes there's an acute threat posed by Russia, and also that there are these persistent threats. You got to worry about North Korea, you got to worry about Iran, you have to worry about violent extremists. But we put out a strategy, Secretary Austin put out a strategy that was very clear in focus, and its implementation has been robust and quite serious. And I note that because I suspect some folks are thinking, gosh, there's a whole lot happening in the world these days. And you are exactly right. And yet we have shown the ability for the U.S. Department of Defense to be able to walk and chew gum, right? Where we have been able to maintain deterrence across NATO, where we have been able to surge support alongside 50+ allies and partners to Ukraine, serious, meaningful security assistance. You have seen this in the Middle East, where we have also been able to support Israel in its efforts to defend itself from Hamas, while also being able to assist with humanitarian assistance and to work to contain the conflict and deter anyone who might think that it would be a good idea to try to make this a bit larger, all while focusing on the Indo-Pacific. And as I briefly noted, we just had about the most transformative year in terms of our Indo-Pacific posture, and also in terms of working with our allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific as well. So it's important that we focus. It's also important that we are, as you said earlier, in fact, that we are dynamic, that we are agile, and that we can recognize when we might need to move a little bit one way or a little bit the other way as we are trying to realize that vision.
That is a lot of chewing gum as we're walking. Keoki, I'm going to have to cut you off because we've run out of time. I just would encourage everyone to read the paper. As Neve said, it's online. It is a very clear distillation of what we were talking up here, which is, yes, it's free too. Thank you, panel. Thank you very much. Great discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to Peter and the panel.